Wait just another 30 seconds for the last of folks to kind of get in and get settled. All right. The time is 10:01 and we will begin today's webinar. Welcome everyone to Minnesota Environmental Quality Board's webinar series, Environmental Review 101. My name is Sarah Larrell. I'm a program administrator here with the Environmental Review team at EQB. I'm going to be the team's primary presenter for our session today. That will include an overview of the Alternative Urban Areawide Review, or AUAR, and EQB's ongoing guidance updates. But before we dive in, I'd like to address a few basics about how to participate in today's webinar. This webinar is being recorded. Recordings are typically placed on EQB's YouTube channel within a week of the presentation, and a link will be provided in the EQB monitor. At any time, you may place comments or questions in our Q&A. Questions will go to our team's moderator for review, and you might be contacted for clarification if we need. We will post the questions we can answer in real time. We have kind of a time crunch today with lots of information. If your question isn't posted, watch for a follow-up after the webinar if you leave your contact information. Feel free to thumbs up or comment on Q&A items that you see on the side. After the presentation, you'll also have a chance to raise your hand to verbally ask a question. At this time, I'd like to ask members of EQB's Environmental Review team to introduce themselves, and we're going to begin with our Q&A moderator, Kayla.
Good morning, everyone. Kayla Walsh with EQB, and like Sarah mentioned, I'll be helping manage the question and answer section today. And I'll hand it over to Sophia.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sophia Muzak, and I am the Technical Assistance Administrator, part of the Environmental Review team. And I'm going to pass it over to Jesse.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Jesse Kurzensky, the Director of Environmental Review here at EQB. Sarah, I don't remember. I think I handed back to you, or are we going back to me first?
Nope, we're going to start with the introduction.
Got it. So when giving presentations and leading discussions, we do always like to kind of give a background about who the EQB is and what environmental review is. So the Minnesota Environmental Quality Board, or the EQB, serves as a forum for leadership and coordination on environmental issues. EQB's mission is to support informed decision-making that protects and enhances Minnesota's environmental quality. And this is accomplished by fostering meaningful conversations, supporting collaborative policy and program development, and ensuring effective environmental review of potentially impactful projects. So EQB is an 18-member board that includes state agency leaders and public members from each of Minnesota's 8 congressional districts. EQB does have 9-member staff, including the executive director, Catherine Nuschler, and 4 of which today, who you met, are dedicated directly to the environmental review program. And as a reminder, the board does promote strategic interaction of multiple state agencies, serves as a forum for the public to engage in environmental decision-making, and functions as the coordinating body or the stewards of Minnesota's environmental review program. So the creation of the environmental review program in the EQB does come from a few different statutes. And so Minnesota Statute 116C ultimately created the board, while Minnesota Statute 116D, or the Minnesota Environmental Policy Act, created the environmental review program and ultimately gave the board authority to adopt rules to implement the program. Now, those rules for which the board has the authority to adopt are within Chapter 4410. The rules then identify what environmental review is meant to achieve, the types of projects that must undergo environmental review, and the different processes and types of reviews that those projects must undergo. And now, before I turn it back over to Sarah, I will end my talk here on some of the things that environmental review is meant to do and some of the benefits of environmental review. So environmental review is meant to gather information regarding all potential environmental effects from pending projects in order to inform the public and later governmental decisions such as permits. Environmental review allows for public involvement early on in projects before they are permitted. The information gathered in environmental review documents allows for all environmental areas to be discussed, and impacts can be analyzed in a single document. Environmental review does not approve or deny projects. It is intended to inform those later decisions on projects. And because environmental review is meant to inform governmental decisions such as permits for projects, those decisions on projects cannot be issued until after environmental review is complete. And so with that, I will hand it back to Sarah so we can get kind of back to the heart and the reason for today's discussion.
Thank you so much, Jesse. Like Jesse said, the focus of today's presentation is the AUAR, the Alternative Urban Areawide Review, the Alternative Environmental Review procedure that is found in Minnesota Rule 4410, 3610. Today, I'm going to provide a brief overview of resources that are available to practitioners, including our guidance update that we completed this year. And the bulk of the show is going to focus on general education about the AUAR. Finally, at the end, we will touch on next steps in EQB guidance development at the end. So EQB has historically provided several resources for practitioners to understand the AUAR rule. It includes just our general website, eqb.com, state.org, including the EQB website in general, which contains information about the foundations of environmental review and covers the basics of each review type. The 2010 Guide to Minnesota Environmental Review Rules is a large PDF, and it's really a foundational piece. It contains a comprehensive discussion of the AUAR rules in its chapter number 6. Chapter is called Substitute Methods of Environmental Review. We also have like a quick reference guide that was last updated in 2015 that provides the process steps of the AUAR in a flowchart style diagram. Today's general AUAR education session is based on our 2026 update. This piece pulled AUAR information from those PDF documents, so not necessarily new information, but gathered information from a lot of different places and put them in one freestanding guide. And we incorporate some of those foundational concepts that are scattered in other documents. This AUAR guide lives online in our webpage in a web format. It is not in a PDF. The AUAR, oh, whoa, sorry about that, guys. The AUAR guidance modernization continues in fiscal year 2027 with EQB recommended content and formats. So we have things that are upcoming. It's going to provide specific question-by-question guidance for modifying the EAW form for the use in the AUAR. It's based on existing guide that was last updated in 2013. The tentative timeline for that guide is spring of 2027. So again, backbone of today's presentation is our completed general guidance. Coming up is the big 2027 question-by-question details. Quick note on the goals of what the 2026 updates were about. And again, since it forms the backbone of this presentation, it's good to give a heads up that we created that web-based freestanding document in a large part to meet EQB's accessibility goals. And it has a side benefit for us in that it is easier to update as new information becomes available. EQB's staff approach based on frequently asked questions that we receive in technical assistance. And we get calls from RGUs, consultants, members of the public, and proposers. We hope to discuss the unique characteristics of the AUAR first and put all those kind of bits out front, then apply those unique characteristics in our procedures. We want to emphasize and clarify the applicability of the AUAR documents and their validity. Our guide provides more detailed action steps. And finally, we wanted to clarify and provide specific guidance for publishing and distributing the AUAR. So with that, we're going to launch into the meat of the presentation. We're going to start with the history and intent of the AUAR. The AUAR was originally developed in the late 1980s as a response to Responsible Government Unit, or RGU, and proposer requests for an area-wide approach as opposed to environmental review's usual project-by-project approach. The Twin Cities Metro was rapidly expanding at that time, and the EQB convened a work group to recommend environmental review improvements for urban and suburban development. RGUs and proposers had cited inefficiencies in preparing and reviewing multiple documents for very similar projects in the same area, and they had suggested that review could be completed in advance, and that could potentially avoid a source of delay. The work group considered whether environmental review for some project types could be accomplished based on expected development within a defined boundary, and in an approach that could provide both environmental review coverage, giving decision makers the information they need, but also support community planning efforts. So ultimately, EQB implemented the AUAR program. It's an alternative form of environmental review that provides analysis based on expected developmental scenarios. Scenarios are hypothetical but reasonable descriptions of anticipated or possible future development. The AUAR can substitute for an environmental assessment worksheet, EAW, or environmental impact statement, EIS, in applicable situations. The AUAR does have some nice advantages for users. It looks at the big picture of a lot of development very early in a planning process. By evaluating environmental effects of expected development all at once, it does provide efficiencies in both the analysis and procedurally. And proposers would have information earlier that could influence construction plans to even potentially avoid or mitigate environmental effects. This approach can also assist in cumulative effects analysis because it takes into account all these expected development in the area from the start. The AUAR document and process does differ from the EAW and EAS, but it is a little bit of a blend of the two. It has those unique characteristics and procedural steps. The rule reads that the content and format must be similar to that of an EAW, but must provide for a level of analysis comparable to that of the EIS for direct, indirect, and cumulative potential effects. The document specifies the anticipated nature, location, and intensity of development, and it actually has two parts to it. There's the analysis itself, and then there's also a mitigation plan included. The AUAR process applies in only certain circumstances. You cannot just use it. It can't be used by just anyone for just any kind of project. Rule states that a local unit of government can use this process, and they can use it to review anticipated residential, commercial, warehousing, and light industrial development and associated infrastructure in a particular geographic area within its jurisdiction. The guidance adds a clarifying statement to that. The AUAR cannot serve as environmental review for certain projects, even if they're within the geographic boundaries and mentioned in the development scenarios in an AUAR. The AUAR cannot provide review for those certain mandatory category project types. There's actually 17 of them from the EAW mandatory categories and about 12 in the EIS categories. These categories include mostly industrial project types or industrial uses like electric generating facilities, transmission lines, facilities that could create air pollution, create or store hazardous waste, process solid waste, and a number of other things. Again, 17 EAW and 12 EIS categories cannot use the AUAR, cannot be evaluated using it AUAR. And then to use the AUAR, the RGU does have to have a lot of pre-work done. They must have a comprehensive plan that contains a land use plan, a public facilities plan that usually needs to include transportation and sewer. And then they need an implementation program to address zoning and other controls for growth. If a community is missing an element in their comprehensive plan, there is a procedure built into rule that allows the EQB chair to approve. EQB's work group on the AUAR believed that the comp plan really represented the minimum that could assure reviewers that a community has addressed growth and growth management and has mechanisms in place to manage future growth without serious environmental harm or social disruption. All right, having covered who can use the AUAR and for what kind of projects, we're next going to look at some of those key elements of the AUAR documents, beginning with the description of the AUAR. In the description, the RGU specifies a boundary of the review area. The boundaries are usually not arbitrary, but they're based on existing comp plans. They might be based on planned development in the area or redevelopment. There may be existing infrastructure where growth is naturally expected. And then it can even include natural features that create the boundaries of your review area. Once it's established, it can't be expanded in a later update. We're going to talk more about updates later in the talk, but once established, the boundary is the boundary. In the AUAR, the basis of analysis is the scenario, and the scenario is a really important part of the description. The scenario is used instead of a specific project. Because the analysis can be time-consuming and expensive, RGUs usually spend a lot of time, considerable effort and time to develop reasonable scenarios in their description of the study area. By rule, at least one scenario needs to be consistent with their comp plan, and one scenario needs to be consistent with known development plans in the area. RGUs may choose a single scenario. We see that sometimes. And it just needs to be consistent with both the comp plan and any things that are planned for the area. AUARs with 2 or 3 scenarios are really common. EQB staff recommend that the RGU is diligent in describing development scenarios to include all future projects actually planned or for which a basis of expectation has been laid. And we use that citation there is in the cumulative potential effects section of the definitions of the rule. We talk about a reasonable basis of expectation. Now, rule does identify plans. It does not say pending applications. So plans don't need to be final or the subject of an application to be known. Guidance uses that cumulative potential effects definition in rule to describe what RGUs need to consider when determining whether a project is reasonably likely to occur. Some of those items include whether there are applications for permits pending. Are there detailed plans and specifications ready already? Are there future development indicated by the adopted comprehensive plans or zoning or any other ordinance that a local unit of government may have? We also want to know whether future development is indicated by historic or forecasted trends, whether that's for population or certain types of growth within the community. The RGU can also use any other factors that they believe is relevant. The RGU has a really wide latitude in deciding what is relevant. So I did want to provide a couple of examples of different scenarios. If you haven't seen them before, or haven't reviewed them, these are random snips, so they're literal images. That's why they're all fuzzy. These are publicly available in the EQB Monitor database, and so that's where all the documents are. This first one is a scenario that features one single, or an AUAR that features one single scenario for a residential development. It includes the number of units expected. It includes the total area of the development, which is, they've chosen to do gross and net area here. The RGU describes the density, and they also are describing building heights in their scenario. It's typically accompanied by a series of maps that are going to outline the location, geographic features, and sometimes they will provide subdivisions in the development of the total area. This next example includes 2 scenarios, both which contain residential and commercial development. This RGU is using their zoning densities and units to describe how they anticipate residential portions of their AUAR study to lay out. In this example, they're actually fairly similar scenarios. They also are using square feet for the commercial area. So they're going to have residential development in 3 different types of densities, and then a commercial area, and the total project area then remains the same for both scenarios. In this instance, it's 962 acres. And again, they are always accompanied by a lot of different types of maps and kind of figures that accompany that description. The project description also does contain information about necessary infrastructure to support the developments. So it's going to include stuff like roads, water and wastewater services or utilities. And it also does ask for a review of the anticipated staging of developments within the AUAR and its infrastructure. Once the area is thoroughly described, RGUs will complete the environmental analysis of the development scenarios using those assumptions that they've stated in the scenarios. It's often based on the maximum development expected or allowed by the land use designation in the comprehensive plan. And so we refer to this as a worst case scenario approach. They're going to do environmental review, assuming maximum build out, and then later, if projects come in, they can use that document to anticipate the effects of the individual projects. The basis of the analysis is the environmental assessment worksheet. They will answer all 22 of the EAW questions for each scenario. So these questions cover a wide variety of potential impacts. It includes items like the development's impact on climate, natural resources like land and water. It asks RGUs to list permits required from them and any other agencies, federal, state, and local. It does require the amount and types of waste generated, the potential impact on fish, wildlife, and plant communities at the site. The analysis can be hundreds of pages. It has all 22 of the EAW questions. You'll oftentimes see traffic, lights, sounds, air, all kinds of different environmental effects that are analyzed. And again, it's analyzed in duplicate for however many scenarios are present. The AUAR is really unique. In that addition to the analysis, there's also a required mitigation plan. It specifies the mitigation measures that are going to be implemented to avoid potential environmental effects. It must contain a description of how each mitigation measure will be implemented, and it includes a description of the involvement of other agencies if appropriate. In practice, RGUs often identify foreseeable impacts and conditions where an action might be required and what those actions will be. So in practice, a lot of times you'll see ideas like this expressed in the mitigation plan. If blank environmental impact occurs or it reaches this level, then we are going to do this action. That might be study it further. It might be build a stormwater retention pond or build another item. It may be that we will require extra permitting or other things or extra review in the permitting process for in whatever it is, additional requirements that they can impose or ask. So we have that project description and that whole front part of those actual documents. I mean, we looked a little bit more at the analysis and the mitigation plan. I mean, we're going to pull away now, back up a bit from those nitty-gritty details of the documents and put our focus back on the environmental review program in general. these big ideas can sometimes be hard to interpret in the context of the AUAR. The foundational tenet, and Jesse mentioned it in his introduction, the foundational tenet of environmental review is found in Minnesota Rule 4410-3100. It's the prohibition on final government decisions that prohibits the RGU from making decisions, typically granting permits, but it can be broader than that, until review is complete. Because the AUAR analysis is based on a scenario, it can sometimes be difficult to understand how that prohibition on final government decisions applies to an individual project in the development area. I mean, to keep in mind, an RGU might receive a specific project application many years after the AUAR has actually been adopted, or it could have been updated over time. So there are some extra steps that we recommend an RGU take. Again, when we apply the general prohibitions in 3100 to the AUAR process, we find that decisions are prohibited until review is complete. For projects undergoing or requiring environmental review, a project may not be started and a final government decision may not be made to grant a permit, approve a project, or begin a project being reviewed by the AUAR until a review is complete, the AUAR is adopted, and then the RGU does need to determine that that specific project in the application is of an applicable type covered by the AUAR review. That project must be consistent with the assumptions that were made in those documents. And finally, that project must comply with the plan for mitigations that's listed in the AUAR. We sometimes think of this as an extra RGU screening process when a project comes in, reviewing the AUAR to make sure these 3 points remain valid. The prohibition on final government decisions for projects requiring environmental review is also in effect if the AUAR is no longer valid. So there are things you have to do to make sure that that document can still provide environmental review functions. So any of the reasons that are listed in Minnesota Rule 4410-3610 subpart 7, I'm going to paraphrase subpart 7's reasons why an RGU would need to update an AUAR. The AUAR, all AUARs need to be updated every 5 years. It's just in rule. Or they may be updated at other intervals if there are significant changes. There may be changes to the assumptions that were underpinning the review. There may be new information available. There may be the planned development or schedule of development is significantly changed. And importantly, if there is an increased potential for or magnitude for adverse environmental effects. So if those things exist, the RGU has the opportunity at any time to reopen their AUAR and update it with new information that can help guide future decisions. All right, we laid out the core elements of the AUAR documents themselves. And now we're going to look a little bit more at the procedural part, how this process moves through with all the decisions that are made and the opportunities for public input. The AUAR actually has 3 different variations that are tucked into that one rule. The standard AUAR begins with the RGU's order for review. That order for review is going to specify the boundaries like we talk about, and in its scenarios and other information maps, it will describe the anticipated nature, location, and intensity of the development. The RGU will develop the analysis and in a draft. And so they're going to be doing the entire 22 questions for the AUAR, 22 EAW questions. And when complete, the draft is published in the EQB Monitor and distributed to agencies. The environmental review has a whole list of agencies that are required to receive copies of all of these documents. It's going to include the big state agencies like pollution control and DNR, and it also includes the Department of Admin's SHPO, the State Preservation and Historic Office. all kinds of local oversight agencies. So there is a pretty wide amount. Sometimes RGUs say when that they are sending out their things to email lists of maybe 50 recipients. Once that draft is published in the EQB Monitor and distributed to the agencies, there are a couple other requirements that we'll talk about a little bit more. That draft has the analysis and mitigation plan basically drafted all the way out. There is a 30-day public comment period at that time. The RGU will collect public comments, and that public comment is open to anyone that wants to comment, not just those 50 agencies or staff of different parties, but that is a public comment process. And then the RGU will take that feedback and revise the AUAR based on that feedback. The time in between here can be really variable. Sometimes RGUs have a lot of work that needs to be done. Other times the turnaround is relatively swift. They will then publish one more time in the EQB Monitor and distribute. This will open up a 10-day objection period that is really unique to this AUAR process. It's not something that's in the EAW or EIS. This is a time for state agencies and the Met Council to work with the RGU. If they have any objections to the plans, they can file those with the RGU. And then the rule indicates a procedure that all the parties can use for resolving them. Essentially, there's a negotiation between the agency that is objecting and the RGU. Once that issue is resolved, the RGU will then adopt the AUAR. The large AUAR is that next variation to the process that's embedded in there. The large AUAR is used in a special instance. We're going to use it when the AUAR includes a specific project that exceeds the EIS threshold, or it takes up more than 50% of that project boundary area. This adds an additional public comment on the scope of the review at the beginning of the process. And then it will continue with the same process as the regular AUAR. We're going to look a little bit more at that scoping process on the next slide. But again, the draft order for review goes out. There's an extra public comment period, and then it continues again after the draft AUAR is a public comment period and another agency objection. AUARs are long-term documents and can remain valid over many, many years if they're kept up. The AUAR process update process is used when, like we said earlier, when 5 years has passed since the AUAR was adopted or last updated. The update is typically based on the original, or it is based on the original, and then it describes the progress of the development and any changes that need to be made. The procedure for noticing, it provides a much shorter window. There's a singular 10-day comment and objection period on AUAR updates. And then once the RGU receives that, they are able to, if it meets requirements, are able to adopt their AUAR. Quick note on that large AUAR scoping step, it's really interesting and was added to the rule later. The additional large AUAR scoping process is used, again, if the AUAR has a big specific project that meets an EIS threshold or it covers 50% of the geographic area. That scoping period specifically is designed so that anyone, including the agencies, can comment on the scope of the review. They can comment about whether an additional development scenario might be helpful here, or they can comment on alternatives to the specific large project that may be proposed in the scenario. They can add or subtract and include any of those types of comments in the reviews. Occasionally, commenters will include recommendations of development sites outside of the proposed geographic boundary. These things are all allowed by rule in subpart 5A. So we're moving right along, and the next part of our talk is about the action steps, but we are going to spare you. So the AUAR guidance provides procedural action steps for practitioners. Our 2026 update was designed to pull out a few of those action steps that didn't seem as maybe intuitive or didn't make sense. We wanted them to be a little bit more discrete sets of actions that an RGU or a staff would actually be taking. Again, we're going to spare you from a deep dive on that, but you do need to know that it's there and it exists. The action steps are a how-to with some optional items. There are some special processes in rule, and then it also explains publishing and distributing the documents. Here is a quick look at the publishing and distribution that we have included in the 2026 guide. The requirements of the AUAR are based on the EAW procedures in Minnesota Rule 4410-1500. But the AUAR has an additional comment and objection period, like we talked about, and it includes a few additional specific recipients as well. So this guidance offers the RGU charts that are specific to each AUAR type. So there's one each for the standard AUAR, the large, and the update. And it is in a skimmable format. It starts with a document that the RGU has produced, and then it goes through people that need to receive it, the noticing requirements in a newspaper or website or general press release, and the EQB monitor. It's especially useful for RGUs that use a consultant to draft the analysis and mitigation, but they then take what the consultant has produced and handle all the noticing and comment portions of the process. And this was designed to be able to help quickly see where a person is in the process of distributing and then get that out to the right people at the right time. So the publishing and distribution charts are actually going to wrap up our general overview today. If people have things, specific questions about those, we did want to leave a really good amount of time here today for questions. So you can start formulating those. But before we hop into that section, I also want to introduce our next steps to EQB's work plan in our guidance modernization effort. With this general EQB guide up and on the website, we now need to look at a form that's already provided, the recommended content and format guide. It takes, like I said before, the EAW form question by question, and it suggests recommendations for modifications that are needed in the context of that multi-scenario AUAR. It may be a big undertaking, and we do want to gather input. To do that, we're having this session today to talk about our progress so far, but we'll also provide an optional session about the plan guidance updates in the coming month. It will be followed by a survey to solicit your written feedback. The surveys will be distributed to recent AUAR practitioners. I will probably go back a minimum of 2 or 3 years. I also have a really helpful group of participants, both RGUs and consultants that worked on the 2026 guidance updates, and then any interested parties. So we're happy to take that feedback, and I will have an email address here at the end of the presentation if you would prefer to do that rather than using our Q&A section. So with that, we've had about almost 40 minutes of solid chitter chatter. We want to know a few different things. First, if you have remaining questions about the general AUAR or questions about the guidance that we just posted this spring, we're going to start there. And then Kayla, I don't know if you are willing or interested. Let's see, it looks like we have some questions in the question and answer. Did you mind reading?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. So I can view one question so far in our Q&A section. Folks, feel free to add or upvote any questions you see. And this question pertains to specifically data centers. So Sarah, the question is, does EQB have guidance on whether a data center falls under light industrial and can be part of an AUAR, or would that be excluded?
Great question. Yeah, we do. We actually have a specific frequently asked questions sheet that does address data centers that can be found on our website. Maybe we can drop a link in chat as well. So a data center would need to look at the light industrial definitions. And so the definition of light industrial in our set of rules, and I'm paraphrasing here, it's a non-manufacturing facility with 500 employees or less. So it's a fairly broad definition. So based on the definition alone, it may or may not be included. What the RGU really needs to look at with a data center, and it can always be included in the review information about it, but it's not a given that that review will provide environmental review coverage. So just because it's in there, if it is not an applicable type, then it would not be able to rely on the analysis and mitigation plan that's in the AUAR. It may need a different type of review, typically an EAW or an EIS. Did that answer the question okay? If any of our EQB friends want to hop in, you can.
I thought you did pretty good, Sarah. I'll add just a smidge here. I think what we know about data centers is that they are not all created equal. And so there's not a blanket answer to whether a data center is or is not fall within the definition of light industrial. There is some evaluations that an RGU will have to do at project specific levels to understand if those data centers incorporate industrial aspects or not of their project that would take it outside of that definition of light industrial.
Nothing to add from me, but we'll pop a link in the Q&A here to highlight that fact sheet that you brought up, Sarah, so folks can have that available.
In short, some data centers may be able to use an AUAR for environmental review purposes for coverage in that way, and some will likely not be able to use the AUAR. Go ahead, Keela.
So I'm actually not seeing any other questions in our chat right now, so we will open it up to folks who might want to unmute, unless, Jesse, did you see anything?
Yeah, I think yours just didn't pop up. I have a couple here that I'm seeing. There's one that mentions a slide that said something along the lines of effect happens at a certain level, then study, mitigation, etc. will take place. Who keeps track of whether a proposer does the study, mitigation, etc.? I think there is a tie into this one. That is a second question. That is, to me, in the same vein, there's what's the monitoring process within the 5-year duration to be checking that the existing AUAR is in fact staying within the original scope? I think some of those are in the same vein.
I do, yeah, thanks for combining those, for sure. So the short answer is that the responsible government unit is the enforcement of their own documents, or they are providing that oversight to make sure that project proposers are following through with those mitigation plans. The Environmental Quality Board, as the steward of the rules, really work at a policy level, and we track the rule, we try to interpret the rule, but we do not have enforcement of the rule. Now, anyone can also use the court system, and that is our usual, that is the primary way that environmental review decisions can be looked at by a court and have additional enforcement if the court deems it necessary. So, yep, the short answer there is that it is really based on the RGU, but it is important to note that most projects will have permits that they're getting from multiple sources, and the DNR or the Pollution Control Agency or the Department of Agriculture, or any of these agencies that may be permitting something in that development area, are not going to be able to give permits unless they are are able to see that the mitigations that they require are in there. And so oftentimes the mitigations can be enforced by the ongoing regulatory authority of these other agencies that are involved in the review as well. And with that, I'll open it up to the other ER friends.
Thanks, Sarah. So we have another question in the Q&A. Nicole asks, if a data center campus is designed to have each data center on the campus to be a separate project, would you agree that this allows hyperscale data center developers to skirt or rather exploit a loophole in regards to the EIS threshold, or covers 50% of the geographic area? So looking at how to handle separate projects on the same scenario.
Yeah, you know, environmental review does have some built-in safeguards and requirements that when a data center is, or when a project in general is undergoing environmental review, they're looking for those thresholds of review to include all parts. We do the project as a whole. And so in that way, environmental review hopes to capture, or does capture, the entire expected environmental effects of a data center. For a data center, it's not necessarily going to be, well, it can be a lot of different things. But for example, if you have a data center that has a need for power that is above the thresholds that are described in rule. So for example, if they are going to have an electric generating facility on site that is greater than 50 megawatts, they cannot use the AUAR and instead are going to be using environmental review procedures with the PUC under 216I, the Energy Infrastructure Permitting Act. Other thresholds might be for square footage or other things that are going to prohibit the RGU from using the AUAR. Typically, though, you know, you're going to see, we imagine that we'll see it with power generation or on-site power generation being a real area where it may be likely that a different sort of environmental review will be required. I got lost there in the middle. I'm not totally sure if I got it all. Keela, you can tell me, and Jesse, you can hop in too.
Nope, I think you covered it all.
I think you're good. There was one that I wanted to add to on the previous question about the monitoring and the implementation of mitigation. So there is an additional wrinkle to AUARs where the EQB chair may request the RGU to report on the status of the actual development within the AUAR. And so there is that additional sort of monitoring that may take place.
Thank you.
And I'm just going to refresh my chat again here, Sarah, but I'm not seeing any new questions. Oh, I'm seeing one that just came in. So
Sure.
if an AUAR is adopted and then in the PUC dockets later on, there is a mandatory category for that project, does the permitting process kick in and say, no, go back and do an EIS on that project?
Well, we can't speak for the PUC. We can speak in general terms about the process. And the PUC's process requires that the environmental review that is stated in rule is completed for the project before they can, you know, get a certificate of need and site permits and that sort of thing. So if there is a project that has meets that EIS threshold, then again, I cannot speak for the PUC directly, but in general, if it meets a threshold of anything outside of the AUAR, then it will need to do review on the project at that level that's stated. You see, does a permitting process kick in and say, no, go back and do an EIS on the project? Yeah, the permits cannot be issued until the environmental review is complete. see.
Thanks, Sarah. We have a new one just came in. Next question. With the influx of hyperscale data center development on our horizon, is the EQB considering this in our revision of AUAR requirements, specifically to close any loopholes that seem to be present, which allow for AUARs to be used on projects that very clearly should require a full EIS?
Great question. And I want to be really clear that our guidance documents are guides. They are not legally binding. And so when we're looking at, I think the phrase was about loopholes, if there are areas where the rule does not address something that needs to be addressed, it does have to be addressed in rule. And there are different procedures to do that. EQB could do rulemaking. There's several different ways that can happen. That's typically a fairly detailed and long process of a couple years, perhaps, but it can go faster too. And then there are other ways that different laws can be passed, including legislative options. EQB as a board that is a state agency that takes its direction from the legislature, and if directed by the legislature to change our rules, we will do that. So our 2027 guidance is not going to be groundbreaking or have anything that it's like, a precedent or sets a new standard that EQB would develop. We are not able to do that. We don't have the authority to do that. But what we can do is to take court and judicial decisions that may be pertinent to this process and use those in that guidance so that we can hopefully interpret the rule and then encourage RGUs to use that knowledge to modify, if they need to modify their practices. So again, we are not able to break new ground in a guidance document, but we can clarify, we can pull things out, we can provide new sources of information that help an RGU understand what's really being asked.
Awesome. And then we have a suggestion from Aubrey for the 2027 update to, okay, so she says a suggestion for the 2027 update would be that any PUC dockets for the project that are in the works need to be listed in the AUAR. And I think that is an idea that we can, we'll save any ideas from the chat and consider them.
Yeah, thank you, Aubrey. And I want to remind people that you are not trapped by the Q&A. You can also raise your hand. If it's the little button is right at the top if you'd like to just ask your question. We have the moderation simply because we had so much material to get through that we wanted to make sure that the chat wasn't dinging a whole ton. Yeah. All right, Kayla, do you want to or Hazel, are you able to unmute? I don't think we practiced this, but I want to ask you if that is possible.
Yes, and I just unmuted Aubrey.
Fantastic. Aubrey, if you are ready, you can attempt to talk. Sometimes it's glitchy, and I know like right now mine shows that you are still muted, but I don't know if that's the case for other people.
Yeah, I'm wondering, I guess it's a part questions and part suggestion.
Sure.
Potentially. One thing I've noticed in some of the AUARs that I've read is, in theory, it's supposed to be like, your worst case scenario of these projects. So you should see two numbers, a worst case and like a best case is kind of that underlying assumption. But yet, when it comes to like water usage, for example, they only give one number. But you've got two very different projects, or the size is very different, but yet there's only the one number. So I guess one question is, how does it work that they can only give one number if this is supposed to be like a worst case min max? And I guess a suggestion would be to clarify that potentially of like, if you've got two opposing projects and you should be seeing different numbers, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. Again, the RGU does have wide latitude in rule about the information that they use and they post. And so they do not have to put a minimum and a maximum. I mean, they don't actually even have to do a maximum. They just, they set that maximum for themselves, and then they will do the analysis. But it is to include that analysis for each of the scenarios that are presented. So I think that's a really good suggestion, and we'll make sure to note that.
Can I add quick to that, Sarah?
Please.
I mean, often, or I would say almost all cases in AUARs, a comprehensive plan is relied upon to identify what your maximum is based on what a comp plan would allow for those scenarios, whether that's a residential density or a commercial density. So those are heavily relied upon here in those instances as well.
All right. Do we have one other hand raised, Hazel? Let's see. Beth.
Yes, Beth can.
Awesome. Thank you. Beth, when you're ready, you can go ahead and start talking. There's usually a lag, so don't be disturbed. You may need to unmute your own microphone up at the top as well.
If there is a beginning, we're already beginning in AUAR, and yet there is a potential of it going for 5 years of the entire development. Will the 2027, do you foresee having major changes that we'd have to redo things, or once this is done, will that take care of it?
Okay, the question was whether or not there would be major changes in the 2027 guide?
Yes.
Or, okay, yeah, we won't break any new ground because we aren't able to. Rule changes have to happen in that process that we talked about before. But again, we will do our best to take in any information that becomes available in the meantime. So we have, maybe about a year before this will be out. We're thinking spring of 2027. And so there's potential for us to gain information from a variety of court cases that are currently in progress. And we do use guidance to address precedential opinions and to add kind of interpretation and commentary that we gain from those things. So I think that'll be, depending on whether or not if those things are available. I am not aware of scheduling or when opinions are happening. But we would include those if we had the opportunity. So that is, something that we look for. And then with the ability to link, it becomes really easy for us to include links to a lot of great resources that are provided by our sister agencies in the state for completing different questions. So I think those areas of interest, new information gleaned from courts, additional resources and links. And then if we can provide clarification that is still within the language of the rule as written, we absolutely will do that.
Thanks,
So
Sarah.
we can't change the form itself for this project. That is a separate or different process. But the current form was done, I think, in 2008. I'm forgetting all the dates now. And so there are a couple of notable missing sections of guidance, especially on the climate questions that were added in 2022. So that'll be another area. We've also heard that cumulative potential effects analysis can be challenging for RGUs in the context of an AUAR. And so we want to look at that as well. Again, I don't know yet what kind of directions will end up going there, but we do hope to provide more tools for the RGU there.
Thanks, Sarah. So we have a couple more questions in the chat and another raised hand, but I know we're looking at short on time, so I just wanted to see what you prefer.
Oh yeah. Let's take, it might, oh, this naive question, is that on your list? I can see that one popped up. Or
Yep,
go ahead,
there's that one.
you can
Yeah,
go
let's
ahead
do
and
that.
pick which one.
Well, let's go in order then. So Jess says if an RGU has a comp plan, a capital improvement plan addressing infrastructure needs planning, and a transportation plan, but they're not all in one document, do these documents satisfy the comp plan requirement?
Oh yeah, yep, they can. They can. You know, if there's question, they can ask the actually, you know, that was too strong of a yes. Because rule
I can
does
jump in, sir.
say, yeah, hop in there, Jesse.
I can jump in. Likely yes, would be my quick answer, but there's probably some wrinkles and caveats to that answer depending upon the jurisdiction of those separate documents and making sure that they do, you know, assess the unit, the area, the local unit of government's area as a whole, and not just sort of piecemeal. So there are some likely yes there, but maybe some caveats to that answer slightly.
I
Yep,
think
again,
guidance offers some definitions and guidance on that as well.
Thank you. Good. What's next?
Who would be the RGU for the RGU? If the RGU on a project is relying on an AUAR, but they're wondering, you know, what resources are there to help that RGU or step in for that RGU if there's questions about reliability.
Sure. If any party is aggrieved by environmental review decisions, you know, the analysis itself or any of those sorts of things, the courts are really where aggrieved parties go. Additionally, the ongoing regulatory oversight by state agencies that have a permit, you know, they can hold their or withhold their permits, but there isn't an RGU for the RGU. There isn't like a formal, or I shouldn't say that. There isn't an automatic oversight of the RGU. They have really wide latitude in a delegated program. The program was written this way to allow that. And so, yeah, no RGU for the RGU. EQB does have some ability in rules to, again, request follow-ups and that sort of thing. Certainly permitting agencies may be watching and maybe, you know, watching the conditions of their permit. So that is all part of it, but there isn't like an automatic enforcement.
Can I add to that slightly, Sarah?
Yep.
So the responsibilities of an RGU are basically the program. There is a lot of responsibility in implementing the program. However, one of EQB's main roles is to provide technical assistance. And so that is what we are here for. And that is, again, probably the main reason why we put on these things is so that we can continue to educate and provide opportunities for learning for those RGUs and making sure that we are available to those RGUs so that, especially for AUARs, given that they are living documents and they don't always have the appeal actions after they're, you know, being implemented for 5 years. So we are here. EQB staff provide as much assistance as we can when those RGUs have questions.
So we are going to wrap it up. I do see, Aubrey, you have your hand raised again, and absolutely we should connect outside. I'm going to put my slide up here that has my email address that is available if you'd like to connect. Director Environmental Review has a hotline and 2 different emails for the general program. So you'll always be able to get an environmental review staff on the line. So I do encourage anyone to reach out in that way. You can also reach out if you want to ensure that you get an invitation to attend our overview session and receive a survey to provide written comments. I'm really pleased that there are still 45 people that hung in there for this long on kind of a dense topic. So again, thank you so much for coming and participating in our Environmental Review 101. You can watch for that recording that will be up on the website within about a week. And yeah, thanks so much again. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.